My talk is entitled Beyond Psilocybin, the Clinical Potential of Other Psychedelics, and there are plenty of other psychedelics of interest, as many people around here I'm sure will know. So, I think it's probably time, or we are now at a level of maturity of the conversation that we can start to explore other alternatives to psilocybin, which for various reasons, all defensible, have been put forward for the use of psilocybin in the current sort of psychedelic renaissance. So just by way of a little bit of context, I'd put forward that we have a 70-year history of psychedelic-assisted therapy in our recent history, but in fact, obviously, a fair bit of that has been underground for the last 40 to 50 years following the initiation of the global war on drugs. But now, of course, we're seeing a psychedelic renaissance take place, and it's very promising by all accounts, because in fact it's been pointed out fairly recently that the current wave of global psychedelic medical research has now comfortably endured beyond the original first wave of psychedelic medical research and clinical practice. So as far as psilocybin is concerned, why has psilocybin become the preeminent psychedelic for research and clinical practice, potential clinical practice? Well, essentially, one reason would be is that it's the prototypic psychedelic. In other words, as long as we maintain this serotonergic focus, in other words, the activity of the psychedelics at the serotonin receptor system, then psilocybin is one of the most closely related to the compound serotonin itself, which of course is the monoamine neurotransmitter, which is acted upon by the classic psychedelics. LSD, of course, was used extensively in research and practice in that first wave from the late 1940s through to the mid-1960s, and in fact into the 1970s. But of course, pursuant to the global war on drugs, LSD has carried so much cultural baggage, unfortunately, that it's really quite difficult to see that being used to any great degree for the time being. But there are other reasons for the choice of psilocybin, as we'll see in the next couple of minutes. But nonetheless, as I said before, there's plenty of potential for exploration of other psychedelic compounds, which may provide more nuanced approaches to the treatment of mental health conditions. And I will restrict my conversation today just to medical applications, clinical applications of psychedelics. So just a very brief history of psychedelic medicine, and of course acknowledging and respectfully acknowledging the very deep indigenous prehistory of use of psychedelics for cultural, medicinal and non-medicinal purposes. But we can fast forward to the 20th century when, just at the very turn of the 20th century, when mescaline was discovered by Arthur Heffter and isolated by Arthur Heffter and self-administered in 1896. There was something of a hiatus until the mid-40s when the effects of LSD, of course, were discovered by Albert Hofmann in Switzerland. It wasn't for another 14 or 15 years until the effects of psilocybin were discovered by the Western world, by the Wassons in Mexico. And then fast forward again another 13 or so years until the early 1970s, when the effects of MDMA were explored in a clinical context, and then 2CB through into the 80s. 2CB being probably one of the first widespread use novel psychoactive compounds synthesized by Sasha Shulgin, of course. Now, during that sort of mid-20th century period, it coincided with the dawn of psychiatry, and so psychedelics were considered to be potentially the next big thing in psychiatric practice. I have to emphasise that psychedelic-assisted therapy is really currently the widely used expression for the application of psychedelics to medical practice. because psychedelic-assisted therapy, one will not exist without the other in medical practice as we see it, because it merges so effectively the pharmaco and the psychotherapies in clinical use. Just very briefly, which mental health conditions appear treatable by psychedelic-assisted therapies. And you'll see very quickly that these are what we would tend to call the mood disorders or affective disorders. So things like end-of-life distress, anxiety and depression, substance use disorders, OCD, eating disorders and body dysmorphia, and so on and so forth. And we can expect that the list will extend as time goes on, as further clinical research takes place. Now, it would appear to people who are familiar with the neurological mechanisms or structures underlying these conditions that there are probably common factors which underlie the efficacy of psychedelic-assisted therapy for mood disorders. And so I'll go into those in a couple of minutes' time. But what we can also say is that there appear to be some conditions, mental health conditions, which are refractory or resistant to treatment by psychedelic-assisted therapies. In particular, those are related to psychosis, schizophrenia, for example, well-entrenched personality disorders, and then possibly bipolar disorder, although this is now the subject of some further research and a fair bit of discussion. So how does psychedelic-assisted therapy work in medical or clinical practice? Well, it appears at this stage that there are two main networks of regions in the brain, in the human brain, the default mode network on the one hand and the salience network on the other, which are influenced in certain ways by activity at the serotonin receptor system. And generally we differentiate the 5-HT, the serotonin, 2A, 2C and 1A receptor systems, which seem to be almost solely responsible for the psychedelic effects of classic serotonergic psychedelics. In clinical practice, it appears that there are some key effects or key factors which positively correlate with the positive clinical outcomes. And those are what we'd call the transcendent or the mystical experience, leading to a sense of oneness or the loss of boundary between the individual and the outside world, the universe, nature, other people, and so on. And there are certainly other therapeutic elements which come into play. But at the neurological level, then it appears also that there's a degree of regeneration and modulation of neuronal interconnections, which appear to be downregulated or diminished in the course of mental health conditions such as depression, anxiety, and so on. In many cases, they're likened to a rigidification of thought processes, and so it seems that the effects of psychedelics at the neuronal level and also the behavioural level are to reset those connections and to reintroduce some significant degrees of flexibility in previously rigidified systems. So why is psilocybin so effective on the one hand as a psychedelic in treatment, and then why has it become so popular, essentially as the only classic psychedelic for the time being involved in medical research? Well, certainly psilocybin has the advantages of being a natural product. It can be extracted from a number of up to 100 species of mushrooms, and it can also, as it happens, be synthesized quite readily as well. The toxicity level of psilocybin is really is not well established, because it appears at this case that at this point that there has been no toxicity in humans, measurable toxicity, although toxicity has been established in rodent models. Psilocybin appears to elicit a significant depth of experience, and this seems to be related to the tryptamine class of psychedelics. It has a well-defined but manageable duration of action. which generally is in the sort of 4 to 6 hour range, which is considered to be clinically and therapeutically tractable. Longer periods of action can be exhausting both for the participant or the patient and for the attendants or the therapists. And so this sort of 4 to 6 hours appears to be quite a sweet spot in terms of the timing of therapeutic action. And then also psilocybin elicits a very steady dose response with great reliability. So it can be titrated quite effectively. And it appears that the intensity of experience can be replicated from one subject to another. Although I'm sure a lot of us have met various hardheads over the years who we'd say would need significantly more for therapeutic response. But at this stage, we have found that there is a steady dose response. On the other hand, psilocybin has some identifiable limitations. It is a tryptamine psychedelic, as I mentioned before, and so there are certain transcendent dimensions of the experience which might be considered difficult by some people, in fact, too difficult for clinical or therapeutic application. And so this would represent, in some cases, a limitation of psilocybin. And probably the most immediate psychological or mood responses to psilocybin, particularly the onset of a psilocybin experience, tend to be anxiety and dysphoria, and some people might regard these as being therapeutically problematic as well. So the question is certainly, could other psychedelics achieve similar therapeutic outcomes? But we have to give the proviso that any and all alternatives would need to be assessed in terms of similar considerations to psilocybin, alongside the standard considerations that come to bear in any development of new medicinal approaches. So the key considerations from our point of view are the safety, on the one hand, of any other psychedelics apart from psilocybin that could be used in therapeutic practice, and their efficacy in the treatment of mental health conditions. We would like to have well-defined and identifiable mechanisms of action, and then we need to take careful note of the duration of the experience. As I mentioned before, too long an experience is potentially problematic and exhausting, tiring for both the patient and for the therapists. Too short an experience may actually make it difficult for the patient to gain full benefit from a psychedelic experience, because in fact there perhaps may not be enough time to experience the emotional processing that needs to take place in certain therapeutic contexts. And then unfortunately we're still to a degree subject to the ongoing resistance to non-clinical use, particularly by authorities around the world, and so the potential for non-clinical use does come into play in terms of the consideration of new psychedelics. What we can say, of course, in relation to most of the classical psychedelics is that, in fact, they are considered to be non-reinforcing in animal models and to a degree in human models as well of use. So in general, they are considered to be anti-addictive, or at least non-addictive in clinical and non-clinical use. Just briefly, the risks and the adverse effects of psychedelics and other drugs are reasonably well characterised. At the physical or physiological level, then you can see that there's a range of what might be regarded as side effects or adverse effects, which in many cases are not actually directly related to the serotonin receptor effects. They tend to reflect the activity of certain compounds at other monoamine receptor systems, such as the dopamine and the adrenaline or epinephrine receptor systems. And so if psychedelics are to be considered for clinical use, then a separation of their serotonergic effects probably would be advisable, separation from their dopaminergic and adrenergic effects. In terms of their psychological risks or adverse effects, then anxiety and panic, as I mentioned before, can be very immediate and initial issues, and that is probably the basis for what people have been calling the bad trip for many, many years. But essentially, with careful preparation and then careful integration following a psychedelic experience, then it appears that the risks of anxiety and ongoing issues can be mitigated. However, extreme psychedelic experiences can result in some further issues such as existential crisis and depersonalization. There is definitely widely regarded a need for careful screening for people who might have a predisposition, a personal or family predisposition to psychosis or schizophrenia. And then eventually there could be concerns around ongoing depression which might ensue after a particularly transcendent psychedelic experience. So these are considered to be potential side effects that should be considered in relation to any new psychedelic treatments. The effectiveness of psychedelic-assisted therapy does seem to be dependent on the intensity of the experience. They do correlate quite closely. And there are considerations related to the phenomenology or the quality of the experience itself, the degree of the intoxication by a psychedelic. And that degree of intoxication may have an impact on the capacity for a patient or a participant to actually access the mental processes that are required for therapeutic benefit. As I mentioned, the intensity of ego dissolution or the mystical experience does seem to correlate positively with the therapeutic outcomes. This can also relate to the capacity of a patient to access memories and to process those memories or emotions. And then ultimately we're always interested in the persistence of therapeutic benefit or therapeutic effects. And so these are all, again, considerations that would come into play in determining whether any new psychedelic might be applicable to therapeutic practice. So we can move on to the chicken wire diagrams, the alternative options for psychedelic use. The first class is phenethylamines, and mescaline is, of course, the prototypic phenethylamine. It also has a well-established safety profile and a long history of human use, of course. Most of the following compounds in the phenethylamines were developed originally by Alexander Shulgin and then David Nichols in the US and several other laboratories, key laboratories around the world. The very short list I've placed here varies quite dramatically in duration of action, in intensity of action. You might note that the first line, 2CB, 2CI, and so on, are the 2-carbon phenethylamine compounds. The next line, the DOI, DOB, and so on, are actually psychedelic amphetamines. And they tend to have around 10 times the potency alongside 10 times the duration or so of the phenethylamines themselves. Now, some people might become rather sort of shocked and concerned about the inclusion of the dragonfly and other fly compounds, as well as the N-bomes, in my list of possible therapeutic compounds. The reason I've put them in is that of the serotonergic psychedelics developed so far, these appear to have the purest, among the purest action at the 5-HT2A receptor. And so if we were to be trying to develop new psychedelic compounds for therapeutic use, then these compounds already exist, and there's potential perhaps to explore them in a clinical context to determine whether there might be any application for them in the future. The tryptamines, of which psilocybin is, as I mentioned before, one of the prototypic compounds, embrace or include a broad number of other compounds. They differ from the phenethylamines pretty much in just the double ring indole scaffold rather than the benzene ring. DMT and 5-methoxy-DMT are currently the subject of a good deal of interest globally from a therapeutic point of view. DMT being the active psychedelic, purely psychedelic ingredient in the ayahuasca brew from the Amazon, and 5-methoxy-DMT is a subject of quite considerable interest now, and we're likely to see some research to take place in short order. Alpha-methyltryptamine is very interesting because it's actually the tryptamine analogue of amphetamine, and it was used. It's known to have antidepressant properties through its monoamine oxidase inhibitory action, and it was used therapeutically through the 50s and 60s, I believe, in some parts of the world. DIPT, diisopropyl tryptamine, is interesting in that it's one of the very few classic psychedelics that doesn't have much in the way of visual but rather oral effects, and so certainly worth exploring in a therapeutic context. The ergolines are generally based on or related to LSD, and there's a series of LSD analogues which could be of interest because of their shorter duration of action. And although LSD was used considerably in therapeutic application in the 1960s, as I said before, it carries quite a lot of cultural baggage currently. However, there is a series of analogues which could be worth exploring. And I've included the beta-carbolines in this list primarily because harmine and harmaline are two of the three compounds which potentiate orally inactive compounds such as dimethyltryptamine, DMT. And they have psychoactive effects of their own, and they could have some potential. They're already well known to be monoamine oxidase inhibitor type antidepressants, but they may be able to modulate the positive therapeutic applications of the classic psychedelics. Very briefly, the pharmacology of any new compounds needs to be determined with some accuracy, and so an approach that's commonly applied is called receptor screening. And so this figure actually represents a broad range of about 25 or 30, I believe, human receptors against which a number of compounds are checked for their affinity. And so essentially the compounds to the left of of each of these two strip diagrams are the most potently binding to the receptors. And so the vertical black line in the middle represents essentially the threshold of activity. The two compounds represented here are DOB and DOI. These are the psychedelic amphetamines that I mentioned earlier. And they have extended duration of action. But as you can see, particularly DOI has quite a broad range of receptor activities, well beyond the serotonin receptors. And so what's known to be a sort of a dirty drug phenomenon, and LSD is quite notorious for that as well, is cited as being potentially a confounding issue in therapeutic application. However, on the other hand, it's possible that this breadth of receptor activity could actually be harnessed and could provide potential benefits. So the other receptors we're talking about tend to be the noradrenaline or norepinephrine receptors, the dopamine receptors, histamine, and so on and so forth. And all of these could have behavioural effects through agonism by various of these compounds. Another complication, of course, is that some of these compounds are known to bind to the monoamine transporters in the way that MDMA binds to and reverses the action of the serotonin transporter system in the presynaptic neurons. There's a concept that we call functional selectivity or biased agonism, which is one model, at least one compelling model, for the different experiential activity, experiential effects of psychedelics on the one hand, but also, of course, there's a number of serotonin receptor agonists which are actually totally non-psychedelic. And so this selectivity, which is related to their effects, their actions as G-protein receptors, is implicated in this breadth of experiential effects. Dose response is very important because it's important to be able to try and titrate doses and to achieve a reproducible and predictable response from a given drug. And then ADMET stands for administration, distribution, metabolism, excretion, and toxicity. That's a common acronym in pharmacology and pharmaceutical development. And these concepts do come into play in drug development, as I'll discuss soon. Although psilocybin is used singly in therapy at the moment, there's certainly potential for the use of combinations of drugs which might synergize very effectively and thereby require less of a particular compound less total quantity of psychedelic material administered. Certain phenethylamines, for example, or tryptamines could be applied together, but they actually could be applied in combination as well. A number of people will be aware already of the strong positive synergy between MDMA and both tryptamines and phenethylamines, although it needs to be stated that a number of these compounds, because they do bind to the serotonin receptor, the serotonin transporter, can result in the risk of serotonin syndrome and some adverse effects. So it's important to characterise these sort of combinations very carefully. Matthias Lichty is noteworthy at the moment, in my mind, because he has, within the last week, he's a researcher in Basel in Switzerland. Within the last week, he's applied for a US patent essentially protecting the intellectual property associated with the administration of MDMA in conjunction with classical psychedelics. So there are people who are already working pretty actively in this space. Matthias Lichty is a very prominent, prolific and highly regarded researcher in this field. But it's interesting to see that there's already some work to try and wrap up this intellectual property. And then the beta-carbolines, as I mentioned before, particularly harmine and harmaline from natural plant sources, are already effective in combination with some classic psychedelics. And then there's certainly potential to explore beta-carbolines as adjuncts to the use of others in therapeutic practice. Many people will be familiar with the concept of the entourage effect. Pharmacological tofu was a term coined by Sasha Shulgin in relation to 2,4-D, one of the phenethylamine compounds, which he regarded as not having a strong psychedelic effect in and of itself, but it was thought to fill out or augment or somehow support the effects of other psychedelics in combination. One of the major considerations at this particular point is the question of drug development, novel drug development, and the drug discovery process is well established in the pharmaceutical field. SBDD stands for structure-based drug discovery, and that essentially was the approach, or is the approach, that is being used in the potential development of active psychedelics for therapeutic use. The next step would be receptor screening, which, as I have illustrated earlier, is a way of determining the breadth of action of any given compound against a range of the receptors in the human brain. Hit to lead is the process of developing initial relatively low affinity hits through to higher affinity leads and then on to commercial drugs. Preclinical research is the pre-human research phase, which tends to take quite a lot of time and chews up a lot of funding before human clinical research can take place. And then, of course, the final stages of the introduction of any novel psychedelic compound into therapeutic practice would require effectively rescheduling from the most restrictive drug schedules currently in in effect in relation to psychedelics. And then, of course, the very costly process of medicines approval and registration in various jurisdictions around the world. As I noted, all of these are very costly processes, and it's no surprise nowadays to hear of between $1 and $2 billion budgets by pharmaceutical companies in the development and commercialization of new drugs. So just to finish off, I just wanted to throw a few questions out there. Where are we actually heading in this field? Certainly psychedelics have suffered in the political and the social context from the ongoing war on drugs. And fortunately, we are seeing a change in the conversation as the medical potential of a number of these drugs is being explored. But nonetheless, there's a lot more sophisticated conversation to take place. But at least we're seeing the media and the general public discourse really moving back around towards the acceptance of psychedelics and their clinical potential. Research and development are going to be extremely important, but of course we have to recognise that there's already a very rich collection or library of psychedelics that already exists. This is a particular interest to me because there's in this new wave of an excitement of psychedelic drug development. It appears that the commercial aspects are starting to really overtake the conversation generally, and so we could see interests such as the research enterprise, the intellectual property, patent lawyers, and so on. And then the longer-term financial aspects of the new drug development coming into play, and perhaps actually eclipsing the fact that we already have a huge number of very active psychedelic compounds which have not been adequately investigated for their therapeutic potential and, in fact, for their non-clinical potential as well. Of course, we always have the medical considerations of safety and efficacy, and those will continue to play a part in the decision-making in relation to any other new psychedelics that might replace or augment psilocybin in therapeutic practice. And then clinical translation is always going to be very important because we have the whole health enterprise which comes into play. And so ultimately we would be hoping to utilise psychedelics to help to assist humanity in both mental health as well as potentially physical health. Nonetheless, I think this point of preventative health and well-being is extremely important, and so there are many other aspects which come into play rather than potentially the application of psychological or psychiatric band-aid medications. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm very happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Martin, for that presentation. And we do have some questions, and I'll just bring those up. Our first question from the YouTube chat, and thank you to those who have dropped a question in. Our first question is, after psilocybin and MDMA, what psychedelic do you expect to boom next? Any crystal ball gazing or... thinking of all sorts of crystal balls now.
I guess following from what I said in the last couple of slides, it's probably the one that hasn't actually been invented yet. But I would like to think that some of the phenethylamine compounds such as 2CB, 2CI, and then there was a sneaky one that I put in at the end of my little list there called 2CTFM. Very few people would have heard of that at this stage, but these are compounds which are known to be relatively warm, friendly, provide a positive affective response, so in other words an immediate antidepressant response, and then potentially if used in combination with psychotherapy could really provide some excellent outcomes. So my sense is that there will be significant effort placed into developing compounds which are similar to but not quite identical to these compounds which already have overall a pretty good reputation. Unfortunately, as I mentioned before, the implications of non-clinical use are still currently of concern. And so there may be some efforts placed into developing compounds which don't have quite as much of a happy feeling as in their effect profile as well.
Thank you, and do keep those questions coming in the comments. Oh dear. Just wait a moment. The questions in the YouTube comment section, thank you for dropping them in so far. To everybody who is engaging in the conversation there, we are hearing from Dr. Martin Williams from PRISM, Psychedelic Research in Science and Medicine. You can find out more information at prism.org.au. And our next question, what are the role of, I'm pretty sure that's meant to be dimmers, not dimmers, at the 5-HT2A receptors, and how does this affect the therapeutic effects of psychedelics?
So dimers is actually the word, as I would understand. So dimer means two particular compounds, or in this particular case we're normally talking about receptors that join together and may have a different functionality compared with those single receptor molecules. And remember, the receptors we're talking about in this case are generally G-protein coupled receptors, and they are large protein molecules which are embedded in the cell, the cellular membrane. And I suspect that what we're talking about is an interesting observation and a series of hypotheses that have followed. The observation is that the 5-HT2A, the serotonin 2A receptor, appears to dimerize or to associate with what's called the metabotropic glutamate receptor number 2. So they're two quite different receptors for two very, very different groups of compounds. But it's possible that in association together as the heterodimer, then they may be responsible for the psychedelic effects themselves. I have to say that at this stage I think that's really not well established as yet. And in fact, going back to that concept of functional selectivity or biased agonism, these may turn out to be competing, they may turn out to be complementary theoretical frameworks for the psychedelic, the experiential effects of psychedelics. Now, as far as the potential to utilise that heterodimerization in therapeutic practice, I'd say that's a fair way down the track until we have a better understanding of what's actually happening. Then I think it's going to be difficult for us to really establish and to find ways to harness those possible forms of activity, I guess. So yeah, tricky, very, very interesting concepts. I think we've got a lot to learn. Now, I know that some people have posited that there's certainly a range of compounds, for example, that are quite closely related or structurally related to LSD, but which have no psychoactive effect whatsoever, and lisuride is the one that comes to mind. Now, whether lisuride does bind only to the 5-HT2A receptor and elicit no effect through this functional selectivity, or whether it is more a matter of this heterodimerization of the metabotropic glutamate receptor and the 5-HT2A receptor, I don't think we have an answer as yet.
Our next question. Will future trials of, and this one is thank you to Stephen, hang on, now I've forgotten the acronym. Psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy, or PAP, thank you, Stephen, in Australia, obtain psilocybin from native mushroom species, be synthesised or imported from elsewhere in the world?
I think there's certainly plenty of scope to develop beyond the current standard, which is chemical synthesis of psilocybin. And this brings us back to the entourage effect that I mentioned before, as well as it was actually Juliana in the first talk today was mentioning that she firmly believes that the combination of compounds that are present in natural mushroom sources provide a modulation or a different and, in her opinion, superior effect. experiential effect and potentially therapeutic effect to the single compound psilocybin. There are a couple of alternatives, of course, to chemical synthesis. One is biochemical synthesis in modified yeast or bacterial sources, and this is very, very commonly employed in biotechnological development or production of fine chemicals for pharmaceutical application. The third one, of course, is the extraction from natural mushroom sources. All of those are, I believe, being explored actively. If not actively, then soon to be explored and exploited, I have to say, commercially by any number of new enterprises, new companies that have formed to support this psychedelic drug renaissance. So, look, I think there's going to be a balance. I think it'll be very interesting to see if the entourage effect concept can be applied to psilocybin and analogues, close analogues from natural mushroom sources. So watch this space. I think it'll be interesting to see.
Thank you. A couple more questions, and thank you to everyone for the very lively discussion in the YouTube chat. We appreciate all of the conversation that goes on. It helps to... sometimes you ask a question that hasn't been asked before. Sometimes you ask a question that has been asked 1,000 times before. But either way, it's valid because things change, and if you don't know, you don't know. Our next question. Could DIPT be looked at to reverse engineer, I suppose, auditory hallucinations in schizophrenia? And maybe if you could talk to us a little bit about what DIPT does in terms of auditory hallucinations.
I'm not quite sure if we know the if we have any sense of the origins of the auditory hallucinations that in some manifestations of schizophrenia can be very disturbing and very, very concerning. The auditory effects of DIPT are, again, not terribly well understood by any means, and they're also not particularly reproducible or linear. In other words, it appears that some people experience a very significant tonal shift, so pitch and tonal shift. Sounds can appear to flange as well as to have their pitch decreased very substantially. So, but there seems to be, from Shulgin's account as well as a number of online accounts that I've read over the years, there seems to be a non-linearity there, so it's very difficult to predict. So, look, my sense is that this is not likely to be particularly useful in understanding and certainly treating schizophrenia, unfortunately, but I'd be very, very happy to be wrong in that instance. One of the issues associated or related to my limited understanding of schizophrenia is that the auditory hallucinations can be extremely cogent. They can be full conversations. They can be full-on arguments, and so this is not the kind of thing that people experience on DIPT. That's for sure. And so I'm not quite sure that probably the essential mechanics of sound perception by the brain will have much to say about schizophrenia.
Thank you for staying with us for all these questions today, Martin. Really appreciate it. And
it's a pleasure.
I mean, it's very interesting sounding effects with the auditory hallucinations, but yeah, I suppose it's such a wide area. I think sometimes that word hallucination even gets
sorry, I should clarify also that DIPT has been found to distort perceived sound, not to have anything to do with pure hallucination of sound.
Actually, while we're on that, I won't go into a full rabbit hole here, but how do you how is that different? Like, there's different kinds of hallucinations we've got here. We've got a definition of hallucination, which is a distortion of the sensory array, and then you gave another definition there that was almost like a conjuring of something that is outside of the sensory array. Do we have different ways to define these hallucinations? Are there scales for this sort of thing?
I'm not an expert in that particular field, so I'd love to be able to give you a sensible answer, but I think we'd probably defer to people who have much more knowledge and experience in that field. But it is certainly in many cases the word hallucinogen has been somewhat discredited in the psychedelic community because a hallucination tends to imply something that doesn't actually exist, but is generated by the mind somehow. But also in many cases, it's thought to imply an apparition or a vision that isn't understood to be a hallucination. So in many cases, if we think of deliriums such as the tropane alkaloids, hyoscine and scopolamine and so on, then in many cases people have full-on imaginary conversations with imaginary friends and so on. And so that is a rather different concept altogether, and that's probably where the true definition of hallucination comes into play.
And we have one final question from our comments for you. What are your findings, and this is in relation to the St Vincent's work, and we will be hearing from Marg Ross later as well, but about microdosing for microdosing. Well, actually, that is a slightly side issue then, for end of life and depression. So it's not microdosing in the study, but do you want to talk to that question?
Well, look, I think until we have some experimental results of microdosing in the bag from a number of researchers, then I think it's going to be very difficult to provide very useful insights into that. I can assure the questioner that in fact it's the dose being used in the psilocybin end-of-life trial at St Vincent's is well and truly a macro dose. It's the 25 milligram fairly standard dose being used for to occasion very reliably a mystical or transcendent experience. There's actually a little bit of work about to start in other labs, exploring different doses apart from the 25 milligrams. So it'll be interesting to see to what degree, for example, a 3/4 dose, so 19 milligrams, correlates linearly with the 25 milligram therapeutic. Generally agreed therapeutic dose. But as I say, just in relation to microdosing at this stage, there's probably not really very much we can say until more research results are in.